So I guess I wanted to start by seeing if you could give some of the context for these two plays. What was the milieu that they came out of? What were they trying to communicate? What was their significance?
Okay.
Oh, what I was just remembering is the place where they were put on was called Easy Space, and it was a super low budget place that you could only have in Detroit, I think, at that point.
Yeah.
And it's unheard of nowadays, but basically all volunteer, people wrote their own plays and put them all on. They'd do like 2 or 3 performances. Yeah, just they were community theater. It was a community theater, basically. You have any more you want to add?
No, other than in terms of the plays context themselves, Detroit was a place during the 70s where there was a lot of activity going on, as there actually was in Seattle and New York. The people were feeling a little down because 1968 didn't lead to all the major social changes that we'd hoped for, but people kept going. There were a lot of things we were doing. There was a lot of co-ops, food co-ops, small food co-ops, and women's health clinics, do-it-yourself women's health clinics, not necessarily legally approved, housing, different housing initiatives, different child care initiatives, and in Detroit in particular, and also in Chicago and in some other places, I think in Seattle too, not as much in New York where Robby and I were living, but there were places where people could get rentals of large houses. In Detroit, in the area where a lot of the people around what became the anarchist scene, which was primarily the anti-authoritarian scene, in that people didn't want to necessarily identify with only the traditional anarchists. But in that context, a lot of those people were living in an area that had been built up for low-level car company executives. So the houses were nice and big, but not mansions as such. So then a lot of them became group houses, people living there. But it was not something that was done primarily to make them into communes, although there were other places where people were doing communes in a more intentional sense of trying to have people live in a certain way and follow certain rules. So the ones that were in Detroit were primarily people living together to save money, and a lot of them were people who shared social ideas, so there was a lot of discussion about that, and the question came up, part of other questions, about how people should live together or how people shouldn't live together. And so there were a lot of debates. There were also debates that you can notice in the plays about how much money one should take from the government or big corporations for projects that you thought were really relevant. How much people should become professional, should use their their creative skill to become professionals or shouldn't. And, in general, how much people should try to integrate their survival needs with their social desires. And so both of those plays are really about that. And particularly Illyria Street Commune is about how people would integrate or could integrate or didn't integrate their social desires with their survival needs. Wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like in Revolutionary Purity Showdown, you'll have situations, this kind of one-upmanship where someone say, I saw you have the writer's market on your shelf. And the other person says, oh, you have the farmer's almanac. Or in other words, they take it to extremes. But that sort of gives you an idea, that kind of judgmental attitude that did go on. But in the Illyria Street Commune, it's played out more seriously. And you see them, playing their roles, basically, parallel to what people did in real life.
And none of the people in either of those plays are just one person, but all of them are combinations of people. So if you knew the people there, you could recognize some of the people, but you would notice, oh, this one is a compound of person A, person B, person C, but a little different than all of them, but you can see them. It's like a historical novel in that way. So these are historical, fictional plays, But it was an interesting way of carrying on the conversation. But I will say, somebody asked me, did people resolve the debates or the conflicts that they were having because of this kind of play or these plays? And the answer is no. There was ongoing issues, because that's how it is when you're living in a society that doesn't suit your needs or your desires, and that was true of those people then too.
Then there's the other issue about people who have fallings out over how to put on a play. That's a whole separate thing, but it did happen, and that probably happens everywhere. It's just like, oh, you hammed it up too much, or you didn't read it the way, you didn't say it the way I wrote it, or like that kind of thing went on back and forth.
Yeah, well, it was interesting because Richard Ades, who's the one who wrote Revolutionary Purity Showdown, I sent the play to him and I told him that we're going to put it out, we're going to print it up and circulate it with people. And he looked at it and he said, oh, there's one part that I changed near the end. In other words, I had a copy that somebody had given me where they hadn't noted his change, but even after all these years, he remembered what his change was. So it's incorporated in and even though these plays are fiction and so forth, they are meaningful to people, so that they did remember a lot about them.
But would you want to just introduce yourselves and say kind of what your relationship to these plays is?
Hi, my name is Robby. And I guess I was one of many people who traveled to Detroit to be with our friends there and go to those plays from different parts of the country in the 70s. The late 70s, we knew the people that wrote them and put them on, and like that.
Yeah, the early 70s and the late 70s.
Yeah.
And whatever, yeah. Yeah, Robby and I, my name is Sylvie, and Robby and I both lived in New York, and we were part of the anarchist, anti-authoritarian milieu there, and we had known Freddy and Lorraine as far back as the late 1960s. We met them and corresponded with them, Freddy and Lorraine Perlman, and we got to know some of the other people in Detroit when we went to visit. We were also going to Chicago. We knew some people who lived in Chicago, and we even thought about both moving to Chicago or Detroit. And although we liked some of the people we knew in Chicago, we decided we didn't want to live in Chicago. And Detroit we thought very seriously about, but it doesn't have good public transportation and never did. So we decided it wasn't a place that we could live easily. So, but we visited there sometimes 2 to 3 times a year. We were in touch by letter and by telephone. It depended, like, there was a lot of traveling back and forth. People came to visit us in New York too. And mostly it was hitchhiking across the country, or shared rides, or bus, or train, all of which we did. And we didn't fly. Flying wasn't something that we could afford or that we did all that often. So, but we were visiting there, and we went a lot of times for the plays, and we got some of the plays were given to us, and then some of them we just saw and weren't given to us, but several of them were given to us at the time because we asked, so when people finished the play, they had the script that they worked on and they gave it to us.
We actually have a recording of one of them.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
But it's...
Not one of these, another one. Who is Sorelli?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, we're in the...
name of that one?
Who is Sorelli?
Oh, Who is Sorelli?
Which is a play that Freddie Perlman wrote about the medical industry. After he had his first operation for his heart valve transplant. He had 2, and during the second one he died. But during the first one he was in the hospital and he found it a horrendous experience. And so he wrote a play that's actually very funny. And
and serious.
And we will eventually get it together. We have the transcript as well as the recording, and we will circulate it among people. We just haven't gotten a chance. But yeah, somebody had recorded it, so we have the recording and we have the written transcript for that one.
Is it on tape?
Now it's on CD. It was on a tape originally.
We did get it on.
I think it's an hour and a half or so.
Yeah.
And we have, like, one of the problems with the play script is some of it's parallel, and you have to kind of piece them together to figure out what they really were, what was really happening in it.
What is it is actually, Robby, I figured it out, is there is a narrator at the beginning, and I remembered after I read it over. The narrator summarizes the scene, and then they enact the scene.
Oh, okay.
So that's why it looks like it's parallel, but the narrator is speaking, and as you can hear on the recording.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it was very interesting to hear the recording after years.
Yeah.
We hadn't thought about it. It was like one of these things we carried with us as we moved around the country. So anyway, I'm gonna.
It's a good idea to save stuff.
Yeah.
Save everything until you can't move at all.
Right.
How many plays were there? You mentioned others, but
I think there were 15 or something. We don't have them all, although we know the guy who did save them all, and we probably, if we get to them, we could eventually salvage a lot more of them. But
One was called Double Coupon Day Afternoon, which I guess was a takeoff on Dog Day Afternoon.
Oh, right.
And the other one is about Sister Mary Magdalene. They were really into vamping on religion. Mm-hmm. So they had some plays they did like that. I forgot the rest. It had a long title. And Sister Mary Magdalene was played by a guy with a beard. But what else? There were several.
and you said that people from all over the country would come out to see them?
Yeah, I mean, as I remember, there would be some But Detroit was, it's a pretty big place, so it's like you would say people come from all over the country to Seattle, but sometimes you don't notice, you know what I mean, because they're always there from different places, and then they were glad to be at the place.
Well, also it's like there were connections.
Yeah.
In other words, the people in Seattle were in correspondence and, in contact with the people in Detroit. People from Chicago were people from various places down south, from Dallas. I know somebody who would come up fairly regularly. People from San Francisco and from Los Angeles, from Minneapolis, Minnesota, a few different places, a number of different places where people were, they would come to visit because they had contact. So it wasn't like giant crowds, but
Yeah, right.
but it was, I don't know, a few hundred to 1,000, never 1,000 at one time, but probably over time. And like when people would come from Europe, they would usually stop in New York, stop in Detroit, stop in Chicago, stop in the Bay Area, stop in Seattle, and a few other places too. Oh, and sometimes Southern Illinois, and there were a number of places that they might go, because that's how the connections were. Even though it wasn't like a big anarchist movement like it is now, there were a lot of connections. So.
That's probably how it eventually became a big anarchist movement.
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah,
part of
people,
it.
were inspired by it over time.
Right. And there were, also groups of immigrant anarchists from all over the world, refugees from the Spanish Revolution, refugees from Mussolini's Italy. There were older anarchists in various places too, so that sort of added to it, although that wasn't the main part of it. There was some contact, but it wasn't the main part. But they sort of added to the mix also.
Would you talk about, I guess, how you came to anarchist ideas and became involved in, or radical ideas, and how you became involved in the milieu?
So I guess I came from a more or less very right-wing background. My parents, my family background, they weren't like politically involved, but all their ideas were totally racist and off the wall and outrageous. And I just thought it was wrong. And so first chance I got, I left home, like when I was 18 or 19, and that would have been around the time when the anti-Vietnam War stuff was starting up and the civil rights movement was going on, and so, and I'd hear, I'd be listening to Pacific radio station in New York about Bull Connor, hosing down the protesters in Birmingham or wherever in the South, that kind of stuff, and then I'd hear about my brother throwing rocks at these black people trying to integrate a McDonald's, or not a McDonald's, a hamburger place in the North. So just made it even stronger of a kind of a thing to be opposed to, taking it personally, like. And then I guess little by little I got involved in student politics, anti-war kind of stuff. I was actually involved in some radio projects. Me and another guy were the first people that recorded, I guess it was a kind of teach-in. It was a whole day thing at Columbia in 1965 about protesting, or teaching kind of, about the war, about the Vietnam War. And then got involved in SDS and went to all those conferences and saw all the Stalinists and Maoists trying to manipulate everything they could, and got involved in the Columbia strike and all that stuff in '68. And little by little just realized I wasn't going to be part of the Maoist tendency or any of that authoritarian stuff. But I never called myself an anarchist until like the 80s or something. I kept saying to myself, well, I'm none of the above, I'm just this person who's fed up with everything and, let me go my own way. And there were a lot of people like that. I mean, there weren't, like, numerically, there were anarchist individuals at the SDS conferences, and we would meet them, and that's how we got to know the people in Chicago, Detroit, in the first place. And they had the most interesting literature, and they were really interesting, creative people. So that was that. And some of them called themselves anarchists, but they didn't want to be directly involved in the student movement at that time. But later on, I guess, when the right-wingers started using anarchist as a bad word, then I decided that I wanted to be an anarchist. So that's been that way ever since. I mean, I don't like any ist at all, any kind of ist. But it has a tradition, the anarchist tradition exists, and there's so much you can get from it, might as well. But I'd say we're on our own, really. We just have to build something new, non-ism. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, well, I born and grew up in a poor, multicultural neighborhood. My parents were immigrants. I was among the first generation to finish high school and go to college. My mother, when she came to this country, she went directly into a garment factory at the age of 12, and she didn't go to school. She could barely read and write, just really barely. And my father, I think, went to the 6th grade, and his father was a house painter, and that's what he did for his first job. And the son, who is the house painter, also, since he could read and write, was the person who the other guys would ask to read the newspapers. So, like, this is a time when they were, like, painting by hand. They weren't using machines to paint or anything like that. And so they would all work a little faster so that this guy could read them the newspapers, and then they would discuss the newspapers together. So that was sort of like how my father got his education, by reading these different newspapers and hearing the guys talk about them. But I guess my family was, I don't know what you would say, sort of left, maybe even close to anarchist, but they wouldn't talk to me or my sister about it because they were afraid that we would be hurt if we either spoke any other language than English, or if we knew too much about social ideas. So we sort of picked up things from them, but they didn't exactly tell us everything. So my father used to say at a certain point, like, he's going out to the workman's circle. I didn't find out till years later that there were both anarchists and socialists who were part of it was like a union hall, who were both part of the workman's circle. But my father never told me that. So I sort of got some of the things by osmosis. But then also I had friends from all sorts of backgrounds. And when I was a teenager, I was invited by my black friends to join picket lines, and basically picketing to demand jobs for people. Because in New York, people could, in fact, no matter what their skin color, they could eat anywhere. Maybe if you were not rich, you couldn't eat in a ritzy restaurant, but none of us ever thought about that as such. But jobs weren't as easy for people of certain backgrounds to get, so we used to go around and picket, asking, demanding that people, black people, be hired. So I was involved in that, and then I became interested in opposing the war in Vietnam. But also, I guess the other thing is, my mother came from Russia, a Russian Jewish background, and they fled before the revolution, that because the Tsarist military and the society was very anti-Semitic, and my mother actually lived near Kiev and in a little shtetl Jewish community, and when she was 6 years old, Cossacks passed through the town and, for fun, so they say, shot at the kids in the square, and several kids were killed, and my mother wasn't killed, but she carried a bullet in her arm all her life that was never removed. Like, she couldn't lift her right arm because of that. Like, her arm, she could use it a little bit, but not a lot. She couldn't really lift it up high or anything like that. And she was also very emotionally disturbed. I knew her sisters, my aunts, and my uncles. None of them were quite as emotionally disturbed as she was, but because she saw this thing and she was hurt herself. So they had to flee Russia. They had to be smuggled across the border because it was illegal for them to leave. Borders are very strange things. You can be left in or out. And anyway, and my father's family came from Siberia. They were Siberian natives, and his father, I'm not sure when my father was born, but his father, I know, left Siberia when the Russians were forcing their people to settle down. Not Jewish animists, but anyway, my understanding as I was growing up was that there were people like me and my family in Russia, but that the government was never good in Russia. So I grew up with the sense that the Tsarist government was awful, the communist government was awful, and the people there weren't so bad, none of which matched with what I was being told in school or what the general environment was, but all of which made me more of a skeptic than my parents probably intended me to be. Since they wanted me and my sister to be safe, I don't think they were trying to encourage the kinds of thoughts that I had. But anyway, I became involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and I did find, though, that a lot of the people who were involved were very authoritarian, very bossy people, very manipulative people. So I didn't like that. I also got to know in New York various anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists like Sam Dolgoff, I knew him, and Esther Dolgoff, and a lot of the people around the Libertarian Forum, and also not as well, but I did know Murray Bookchin, and I met other people. So I just sort of felt I didn't want to call myself an anarchist because I knew that although I agreed with some of their ideas, I didn't agree with all of their ideas. So that's why I didn't want to call myself an anarchist. I didn't realize that anarchism could be very multifaceted, and that I could, if I wanted to, call myself an anarchist and say, well, I'm part of the general tradition, but I don't agree with these other guys. Oh, and also, I didn't know, but I knew of Paul Goodman and some of the other people who were more pacifist, and I knew I wasn't a pacifist. So, as much as I respected them, I didn't want to be part of that tradition either. So, but it was through those kinds of connections that I got to know about the people in Chicago before the people in Detroit, and then about Freddy and Lorraine Perlman before they moved to Detroit, when they were living in Ann Arbor and some other things. And So I don't know. It just seemed to grow into it. As far as that goes, it just seemed to be a kind of a natural thing, and I think there were a lot of people around who were like me and who were like Robby, who didn't go away but weren't necessarily calling themselves anarchists for quite a while. And even like people talk about, all these things that happened in 1968, and one of the reasons that they happened is because there were a lot of people around. And also, I also knew, although I wasn't close with the people around the motherfuckers, up against the wall motherfuckers, I hadn't been particularly close with them when they were Black Mask, but when they were up against the wall motherfuckers, they had like a little storefront on the Lower East Side near where I lived, and I used to go and hang out there, but I didn't hang out with the stars. I hung out with the non-stars there. I had an aversion to stars, and some of the people could be, even though they might call themselves anti-authoritarian or anarchists, they could be a bit bossy and domineering. And I also got to know some of the people who became the American situationists, and I was actually good friends for a while with one, John Horlick, and I was on friendly terms with Bruce Elwell and on friendly terms with Tony Verlon, just to a certain extent. I didn't really know Bob Chassie. I met him several times, but I didn't know him. But those are the four people who were the official situationists in the United States. And the other ones who called themselves situationists came later, and the situationists would call them pro-situationists, pro-situ, and they looked down on them, and the other guys looked down on other people. Anyway, I don't know, but I guess the thing that bothers me sometimes when the anarchist academics talk about how the anarchist movement was so sparse after 1968, and I don't think it was. I think they just don't know how to measure it, and that there were a lot of people around and continued to be around, and people just did different things. In times of high activity, people do one kind of thing, and in terms of when big protests peter out, people spend their time doing other things, like cooperatives, like group houses, like healthcare centers, developing other skills and other connections, and that continued. A lot of the anarchist academics want to say everything died down until the late 1980s, which I guess is part of the reason that Robby and I got involved in scanning old Fifth Estates, because there's a lot of record of that continuing anti-authoritarian activity through the 70s and through the early 80s, and I want to be able to show people that there was activity. It's not like all of a sudden these punks came along in the late 1980s and they reawakened the anarchist movement that had been totally dead. Everybody was off doing all sorts of mainstream stuff, and all of a sudden new people came along and reinvigorated. I think there was a lot of stuff going on before that. So that's how Robby and I started to scan a lot of that stuff, because we had been subscribing to the Fifth Estate since it became an anti-authoritarian paper. So we had basically a full set of papers that go back to 1975 when they became an anti-authoritarian paper. And we thought we'd like to share it with people so people would have a better sense of the history that we have.
Yeah, like people talk about the DIY things that's starting in the 80s, but really it had started in the mid-60s. It basically people didn't have money, so the movement people learned how to do their own printing, and they learned how to do all these skills, and it never went away. It's just that a different generation came along and kind of took it up again, and it obviously on a much bigger scale. I forgot recently, somebody we know that got in touch and says, hey, I'm learning all these nice skills, like how to do things with my hands. And, I said, it's another generation of people that, in other words, now the DIY people are further back in the line of march or whatever. It's like, it's great that it keeps going, but basically what happened was after the 60s, little by little, the kind of professionalism started creeping in, where NGOs started up and people started doing movement things for money or getting foundation money or whatever. So then it kind of faded back. Some of it was okay, like things like the women's health centers, that they've proliferated and they're still around, and they do good things. But there were originally the ones that were really kind of grassroots things that people started from their own houses and for all those skills. So then that never really went away. And also like with the plays in Detroit, people making their own culture, that did pick up again in the late 80s, but it wasn't just starting then. It's just another version of it. It's a theme that we don't need mass professional culture. We need our own. That's always been the case. It just looks different each time. Anyway, that's I thought.
Curious if these changes came about because of what was going on, like in the wider culture, or in the country, or if it was more like age related, like as people reached a certain age and maybe like had families or wanted to, age out or whatever, if they just started moving in the direction of doing things for money, or if it was more like the culture broadly was pushing people in that direction, or both, or what was going on there.
Trying to figure it out. I'm trying to trace it from all the individuals I've known over the years and say, what did so and so do, and what did so and so. People, for survival, people went off and learned how to do certain things professionally. Like teaching or being a graphic designer. You can survive with stuff like that, where you can't totally survive by being a movement person unless you have lots of friends who could keep you, and help you get along. But so I don't know if it's age as much as the pressure of survival getting tougher and tougher as time went by. But I think it's true that from the 60s on, a lot of the stereotypes got broken down, so that from the mid 60s on, nobody wanted to be a commuter, or a stuffed shirt of any kind. We all wanted to be different. So then what you had is people just moved in from the suburbs into the cities and settled in the cities and got all kinds of jobs that were there, like in New York, it's such a big media place, so a lot of people got and did those things, and didn't mean that they abandoned their anti-authoritarian ideas. They just did different things. Like, I know a ton of people who used to be involved in Left Bank now, going back to the 70s and 80s, and they're doing things like counseling vets, or teaching, and even some doing writing, some other things. Nobody's getting rich, it's just that, and they're not different people. They've gotten different parts of their lives. I don't, maybe like age related insofar as they've learned some lessons. They're taking them as lessons. They're saying, if I don't want to starve the rest of my life, I better get a skill, or different things like that. So that's. Do you have a take on it, Sylvie?
Yeah, well, I guess for me, it's also, it has to do with the general society. So, like, after World War II, there was a lot of war industry that was left over. And that's when the suburbs began to grow, that a lot of different companies settled in the suburbs, and people were given the opportunity to move to the suburbs and have maybe slightly bigger homes than they had had, and have jobs that were in the suburbs. So there wasn't big suburbs before, but there were a lot of people from poorer backgrounds, working class backgrounds, who were involved in anti-authoritarian anarchist activity in the 50s and the 60s. A lot of people like me, actually, who were first generation going beyond high school, and in lots of places like New York and California and other places, university could be free or pretty cheap. So like I went to, first I went to the State University of New York, where I had a full scholarship because I was a smart kid in high school, stupid in elementary school, but smart in high school because I wanted to leave home. And but then I didn't like it there because there were a lot of kids from the growing suburbs, so I didn't fit in. I went back to New York City and went to the City University, and there were a lot of kids with my kind of background, and a lot of the young people who were in what we called the movement were people from not rich, not well off, not even suburban backgrounds. For us, like, going to college meant, among other things, that we wouldn't have to work in a factory or do the kind of shit work that our parents did, and our parents didn't want us to do. Then some people afterwards started thinking about, now you have the college education, what do you do with it? And for some people, going on to become professional something or another seemed a logical thing. And that might be becoming a counselor or becoming a teacher or whatever. And then for some, like me, I worked 5 years in a university, the City University, and although I enjoyed what I did with the students, I worked with adult students in the evening division, and I really enjoyed working with them, and I had a lot of freedom, but it was a very exploitative job, and I didn't like the way my colleagues interacted. So I got out of that. But for a lot of people, it was a step up beyond what their parents had had. But at the same time, at the beginning of the 70s, all of those manual jobs, of which there were a whole lot before, began to disappear or change. So for a lot of people, it didn't seem like much of a choice beyond doing something professional, that you couldn't as easily go and get a job in a factory if you wanted to. So I think it was societal kind of pressure, as well as people not necessarily wanting to work the way that their parents had, whereas a lot of the older radicals might work a job as a factory worker and then do their social political stuff on the side. But for some other people, it became more interesting to think about, can I incorporate those things into my life? So for me, like, over time, it's taken something to realize that a lot of the young people I meet come from what we are called middle class backgrounds, which I would say are white collar working backgrounds. There were people like that in the 60s and 70s, and they were the ones who became the most visible. But lots of people who came from backgrounds of manual labor or retail workers and stuff like that were around too. A lot of people whose parents didn't have much of an education, and whose parents wanted them to have an education, and who thought that the education was going to lead to a lot better things than they ultimately did. But it's taken, a while for me to think about that. We thought things couldn't get worse in the 60s and the 70s, but they have gotten worse. And we thought the problems of racial and ethnic discrimination couldn't get worse, but in a lot of ways they have gotten worse. The neighborhood I came from was a poor neighborhood, but it was integrated in the sense that, I lived in a public housing project where there were people of a whole lot of different backgrounds, as there were and to a certain extent continue to be in places like Yesler Terrace, which is being destroyed now too. And none of us considered it a really great place, but things have gotten a lot worse. And like the neighborhood where I grew up in Brownsville, where apparently Howard Zinn grew up 12 or 15 years before me, was a neighborhood where you could get to know a lot of people from different backgrounds, but everybody was poor. Everybody was poor. But now a lot of people who I mentioned to don't believe that such neighborhoods ever existed. They did exist in Chicago, they did exist in New York, they did exist in Seattle, and they did exist in Detroit, and they existed in various other places. And they were never considered great places, but now, people would feel a little nostalgic about being able to have associations with other people on the basis of having certain commonality, even if you had tremendously different ethnic backgrounds. So it'd be nice to be able to, people would like to have more integrated neighborhoods. Well, I mean, not everybody, but lots of people, I would, like to have neighborhoods that were more integrated. Where I'm living here now, it's more integrated than other places, but it isn't all that, there's a lot of tensions that even, because of the fact that there are people of different economic backgrounds, which I think is a lot harder for people to deal with. Let's say some of my neighbors are very rich, and it's hard for them to understand those of us who maybe aren't very rich. So,
is that what you mean by integrated? Like a mix of...
what I mean by integrated is people from different ethnic and racial backgrounds.
Okay.
Not, in other words, people living near each other and sharing situations. So,